Hello everybody. Last week I drove the Mercedes Benz AMG C55 Estate, a car that on paper should be all things to all people, but it wound up being a somewhat confused cookie, equal parts bruiser, cruiser and practical family car, at once all of them and yet at the same time none of them. Today I am driving its sporty cousin, the CLK55, but does this have a little bit more of an idea of what it wants to be? Let's find out. As you might imagine, the link between this CLK55 and that C55 is more than just skin deep, with this, the W209 generation of CLK, being based on that W203 generation of C-Class. There is of course still very much a clear familial connection, but you would expect that. And maybe the biggest draw of the CLK is the fact that it comes as either a coupe or convertible, and if you have it as a coupe, it's of the pillarless variety. But for your benefit, I'm going to put those windows up for a little bit so you can hear me just that little bit better. Oh, there we go. Now, unfortunately, this car doesn't have a sunroof, but I do think that in many ways those more than make up for it. Now, like the C55, I think these cars have aged spectacularly well, and now it is every part the handsome older gent that you'd want a 20-year-old Mercedes to be. Even in the classic and some, like me, might say predictable shade of silver, it actually still has a fair amount of presence. So much so that every now and again I do pop into the classifieds just to see if there is a CLK about, but in a more interesting shade. In particular, there's a couple of really rather nice blues that whenever they appear, I always have to say they do take my eye. Now, when you are looking through the classifieds for a CLK, it is very easy to confuse this and the earlier W208, because they often appear in the same searches on account of the fact they've got the same engines. The easiest way to distinguish the two is to look at the headlights. The earlier 208 has 4 individual lights, whereas here they look like they've been left out in the sun a little bit too long and they've sort of blended together. I can see why people do prefer the older one, but overall I think I like the shape of the slightly newer. And I think one of the most interesting things about this car is that the CLK55 is not the top of its tree. In fact, it isn't even close. The W209 itself was introduced in 2001, first as a coupe with the cabriolet joining in 2002, and then in 2003 this 55 AMG appearing. But in 2006 it was then revised and they introduced a new CLK63 with the mighty 6.2 litre V8. That then spawned one of the most memorable of all Mercedes, and one that I have actually sampled, the CLK63 Black. That is a car that has a reputation for being a wild thing, and it's actually one of the very, very few cars I've driven where that reputation is deserved. That car was ludicrous, almost impossible to keep it going in a straight line. It was an absolute riot. However, even that isn't the greatest of all CLKs. That instead is the holy grail, the CLK DTM. Imagine this, but with another 200 horsepower, courtesy of a supercharged version of this engine, and some fairly serious carbon fibre bodywork. It was a tribute to the DTM race car, and built, I believe, by the same people. I actually got to do a video with one, though sadly didn't drive it, a few years ago. I'll put a link to that in the description down below. If you want to see what one's like up close and personal, oh my word, they are sensational. And one day I would love to see what they're actually like to drive. Although I know it might sound daft, but just in case you are watching and you're a bit of a Mercedes fan and you'd like to see something on the channel, you know the Merc that I'd really like to drive, that I think I actually have a chance of? It's the A-Class. The original A-Class. My mum had one of those when I was a kid, and I'd really love to see what they're like. That and an old ML. So if you've got one of those, or indeed anything else, please do drop me a line. And if you have indeed been enjoying the content that I make here on the channel, and you haven't yet subscribed, I'd be really grateful if you did, because it makes a very big difference to me. But to talk of mighty, mythical unobtainium aside, one of the best things about the CLK is the fact that this, the 55, is still a very affordable car. You can pick one up now for well under £10,000. And Phil, this car's owner, is a long-time CLK fan. He had a CLK320, then later a CLK500, and I believe he actually still has both of them. These have now been joined by a GL350 as his daily driver, but one day on eBay he saw this crop up. He's got a sort of permanent search saved for CLKs and always pays attention to the interesting ones. But what caught his eye about this, which at first glance appears to be relatively unremarkable, was the mileage. For it is sat on currently just over 36,000 miles. For whatever reason though, the car had been off the road for about 7 years. Though Phil tells me when he got it and he sent it off to Sam at SPR to have some work done, they did much of the work you would expect to do on a car that's been laid up for so long. So brakes, tyres, they put a new fuel pump in, did some bearings, bushings, all that sort of stuff. However, when the car was then finally ready to get back on the road, they found there was a fault with the gearbox. Upon inspection, it turned out that it had been contaminated with coolant. Apparently, the gearbox cools its oil in the radiator, and there is an issue where the two fluids can then mix. This, of course, is not good, and they suspect that is why the car had actually been off the road for quite so long. All in, Phil spent some £6,000 getting the car back to mechanically good condition, and his next task is to sort the cosmetics, which at first glance are absolutely fine, but look a little closer and you'll see there are a few panels that need a bit of help. There's a touch of rust on the bonnet and various small bits that all need doing and which he will be sorting. He wanted to say a particularly big thank you to Sam though, because he says today it is increasingly difficult to find mechanics that are happy to work on these older cars. Although one of the reasons that he likes them is the fact that they are relatively simple. They don't have the complicated air ride or ABC suspension of other cars, like the CL500 that he once had. They do though, as you've just heard, have things like parking sensors, front and rear, which are operated by a very old school method. You've got a little display here and then one you can see in the rear view mirror. You've also got more than enough go from the engine. This is the famous 5.4 litre naturally aspirated V8, a member of the M113 family, known for its legendary durability and prodigious torque. This makes 367 horsepower and 376 pounds-feet of torque. That's 510 newton-meters, meaning that even when paired with this relatively old-fashioned 5-speed Mercedes Benz Auto, it's still got more than enough shove. At least on paper anyway. Let's just put it to the test, shall we? Yep, that is a very, very healthy engine. Mid-range is the order of the day here. Even at 2,500 RPM, put your foot down and it just goes, and goes well. Sure, the red line is at a fairly lowly, I think 6,500. It's pretty hard to tell on these dials, but that's not a problem. Makes a nice noise too. This car has a standard exhaust and indeed standard just about everything else, including 18-inch wheels. And this is particularly interesting because that C55 that I drove was on 17s in the name of comfort, but I suspect they might have been partly responsible for that car's interesting dynamics. Now, I'm slowly starting to push on in this car, and it would appear that this shares very similar characteristics to that C55, though it does feel a bit better tied down. The big letdown, as you might expect, is the exact same as it was in that C55, the gearbox. And here I think it feels maybe even a little more dim-witted than in that. Over the years they did eventually refine it, improve it, but it's never ever going to be a particularly quick shifting item. Now, when left to its own devices, it's actually fine. You've got both a comfort and a sport mode, which you can change between by pressing the little button here next to the lever. However, it's when you put it into manual and you want to take over that it just falls apart, because you pull the paddle, there is a committee meeting, and then if they can reach a consensus, they will give you the gear that you want. When there are only 5 of the sodding things to choose between, you would think it would be fairly easy, but apparently it's not. However, though later Mercedes AMGs became far sharper, far more wieldy things with a lot more aggression, both in their styling and their drive. And that's a process that really began with the next generation of C-Class, the W204, which when anyone mentions a C63, that's the one you're thinking of, with the nice big 6.2 in it. These, though, they still have a little bit more old school Merc feeling about them. And if you view this as a regular car but with a beefier engine, it does make a lot more sense. And you see, this is a particular problem for the CLK, because in the C-Class, they designed it to not have a V8. In fact, when they did the C55, they had to graft on the front end from the CLK. But these were built from the off to have a V8. So where there wasn't a C500, there was a CLK 500, meaning this really has to bring something a little bit more to the party. To find out if it does, I'm going to have to put my foot down once again. You know what? I think by the skin of its teeth, it does. Very curious car though, this. It actually doesn't feel quite as firm as I remember that C-Class being. And that's really weird, because this is on the larger 18-inch wheels. Maybe they're lighter? I don't really know. It doesn't make any sense to me. It also feels just a little bit more composed in the corners. Now, I don't really think this is ever going to tempt anybody away from their M3, much as I might malign the E46, because I think it is massively, massively overrated. It still is a far, far more competent thing in a bend. This feels a little more planted. It is also far more inclined towards understeer, but you do begin to get into a groove with it. The steering is light. And weirdly, I'm sure it's actually less feelsome maybe than the C55, but still, it works. The car is also not that large, at about 4.6 meters long, though it is basically the same size as the Estate, just slightly less practical. You'll get 4 people in it, still in the boot is a generous size, but it's coupe shaped. I love the interior of this thing. It feels nice and reasonably upmarket for the time. The dials are awesome, even if the rev counter is a little bit difficult to read. And I love those little flourishes, like the fact you've got an invisible needle effectively for the speedo. As is common for Mercedes, they've also put all of the stalks on one side of the wheel. For this, you have 3. At the bottom, you've got the adjustment for the column. At the top, you've got your cruise control and speed limiter, and I like seeing speed limiters. And then here you've got your main one that does your wash, wipe and indicator, although it doesn't like to stay put when you tell it to indicate. These seats are really quite nice, very comfortable, and yet they support you very well. This headliner I'm also not so much a fan of, and I don't know what's happened to it, but it's acquired quite a bit of dirt over the years. Nothing a quick clean won't sort, I'm sure, but interesting to note anyway. I am reasonably confident that this is a real, genuine 36,000 mile car, although it is showing some signs of age-related wear, including the fact that a couple of the buttons down here for the aircon have gone sticky. Somehow Ferrari get a lot of stick for that, pun not intended, yet Mercedes, people kind of forget about it. Honestly, that gearbox really is a somewhat constant letdown. Curiously though, whereas in the C55 I said that I definitely wouldn't want to manual swap it, something that's become quite popular lately, with manuals generally being seen as more desirable and the process being fairly easy. Just take the gubbins out of a CLK320. In this, I actually would. Maybe it's because the rest of it does come together just that little bit more, and having that gearbox would give you a little bit of extra interaction, but I think this car would be ripe for doing that, and then maybe just trying to sort the suspension a touch. In case you are wondering, it's a 3-link setup at the front and a multi-link at the back. Precisely how many links I don't know, but I presume more than 3, otherwise they'd have said it's 3 at the front and 3 at the back. The brakes, nice, decent, fairly progressive. They're not the biggest in the world. I like the fact that, unlike later Mercs, this has a nice, decent, proper gear lever. There's a reasonable amount of storage in here, not quite as much under there as you might have expected. And this is a nice place to be, though a much better one when you do that. That engine is nice, meaty, gives you a good sound too. Even with the standard fit exhaust, you've got that lovely V8 woofle that you get with many Mercs. I think there would also be a fair bit of scope in this for just sharpening that suspension up a touch. The car could cope with it, I reckon. The chassis feels a little bit tauter, a little bit tighter than the C55s did, but the suspension is still a sort of weird halfway house between soft and sporty and doesn't know what it wants to be. Though it does just have a touch more resolve. And all this for less than £10,000. And if you do buy a good one that's maybe got more miles on and has been used frequently, you shouldn't have anywhere near the kind of bill that Phil has had to deal with this one. And in fairness, he shouldn't have had that. This is what happens when you get owners that are not so honest about their cars. And so, if you'll excuse me, I think I'm going to put my foot down and carry on enjoying it for a little bit longer. I want to say a big thank you to Phil for bringing this out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.